Okay, I'm sending it to my folks. It's a vanity piece right now. Anyways, my mom insisted. Okay.
You may have a church set right there, so it's facing you.
It's okay. The recording is all, the vocal is all that really matters. I'm set. But basically, I picked Barbie and Ken to start with because Barbie and Ken, for a lot of us, instantly, if you say Barbie, a lot of people would immediately think, okay, this person is very pretty and very shallow. That's a standard insult that brothers have for their sisters, especially if they like to wear lots of makeup. We're talking about Barbie. One child psychologist that I looked up calls Barbie a superficial cultural tyrant. The Britannica Encyclopedia says she's a plastic doll, 11.9 inches tall, with the figure of an adult woman, introduced by Mattel in 1959. She's a symbol of consumer capitalism and is a global brand. So, she's been scrutinized ever since she was created for her unrealistic body proportions and superficiality, for her endless supply of clothes, shoes, houses, and other accessories. So how does Barbie start her day? Well, if we look at Barbie and Ken's relationship, she starts out her day, in all the books I've read, because even though we know Barbie's bad, allegedly, for our daughters, we still buy the darn dolls for them. And how many, ladies, how many of you play with Barbie? Okay, yeah, let's see. So, how does Barbie start her day? Maybe you could answer this better for me. How does Barbie start her day in all the books that you read or whatever? When you're playing with your Barbies, how does she start her day?
She gets dressed.
She gets dressed. She picks out a ton of clothes. She's always got an unexhaustible supply. She may drive her convertible. She may ride her horse through her 100 acres of land or whatever it is outside of her house. She'll start dispensing wisdom maybe to her younger sister while they do identical ballet moves together. Now I'm talking about all the movies that my daughters got to see and conscripted me to watch with them on more than one occasion. She always does perfectly choreographed ballet moves. Her adventures are with similarly perfect friends, often with different skin tones to encourage diversity. You'll see her do some volunteer work on occasion, but ultimately the only job I've ever seen Barbie actually hold is being a model, and we can just leave that at that. It's not. You could argue that it's a vaporous job to have. She not only has no blemishes, but she has no pores. Okay, completely unrealistic lady. Okay, and lest we start dumping on poor Barbie for her alleged perfection, let's look at her boyfriend Ken. Now, guys, we didn't play with Ken dolls, at least I had Big Jim, I had G.I. Joe, back when he was still 12 inches tall and had a Kung Fu action grip. But Ken, basically, what is he? Well, he's a prop for Barbie. He is interchangeable with many other, nobly named men in all the Barbie movies. They have names like Derek or, missed the other one. Anyways, that's the one that pardon?
Ken?
Ken, or... Yeah, I'm trying to remember some of the other ones that were in my daughter's movies, but I missed it. But he's always perfectly dressed. He's always smiling, just like Barbie is. You can't even see the separation of the teeth. He's always up for whatever Barbie suggests. When I asked my daughter, the other night, she's 16 now, but when you were a little girl, did your Barbie and Ken ever have fights? And she's like, yeah, sometimes. Well, what about? Which movie to see? Do we spank the kids or not? Oh, your Barbie and Ken were married? Sometimes, yeah, sometimes. Okay. But ultimately, here's another thing about Barbie and Ken's relationship. There really is no significant conflict, okay? They do not ever have, in the movies, in the books, or in the fantasies, and ladies, again, you may have done things a little differently when you had Barbies, than my daughters did, but there's no conflict about parents. Mom and Dad, if they're in the picture at all, and I don't think I've ever seen Barbie's parents or Ken's, but Mom and Dad, if they're in the picture at all, there's never any issue over we're going to their house for Thanksgiving or their house for Christmas or whatever. Neither of them ever have a roving eye or a restless heart, which is something that eventually inflicts most relationships that are long-term, especially ones that start back in 1959. They never have discussions about the future. Where are we going to live? Obviously, again, we made a sister Barbie for my daughter Katie a number of years ago, but what religion are we going to practice? Or do they even consider, the deeper questions of life? They have no money issues. There's never a shortage or even a need for a budget. There's always, they just go to their horses. They just go to their lovely cars. They're campers. They're whatever it would be. There's no influences in their lives that are bad. There's nothing to avoid. Really. I mean, there might be a big ogre if it's a Barbie fantasy event or something like that, but ultimately you don't have the bad friend who is leading you down necessarily a bad path. There's no buyer's remorse at all. If Barbie and Ken do get married, or Barbie and Eric, or Barbie and Emerson, or whatever he's named in whatever movie, they all get married and live happily ever after, but we don't see any personality flaws that they have to work on. There's nothing 10 years down the road. And again, those of us who are older have those friends who suddenly realize 10 years into the relationship or the marriage or whatnot, I don't want to be here anymore. Nothing like that. No midlife crisis either. Lucky things. Life is all about, for Barbie and Ken, it's all about fun in this world. So as the result, since it's a series of pleasures, it's very shallow. Ultimately, you might want to think about this. Would you really want Barbie as a trusted friend? Because the deepest and most trustworthy people I've ever known are the ones who've suffered the most, and they've suffered effectively. And what I mean by suffering effectively is they haven't let it break them. They have ended up becoming better persons, better Catholics as a result of that suffering. And we can talk about that. That'd be, I think, a topic for another talk another time, how to effectively suffer. But in essence, Barbie and Ken, they end up being seen. My brother is in advertising, and more than once he's told me, teach your kids to be cynical about what they see on television, because and he doesn't make them evil, they got to pay their mortgage just like everybody else, the folks who make products, for children and television and so forth. But ultimately, what the folks who make products would love is to have us be just constant consumers and never really consider why we're doing what we're doing, what we're thinking about. Oh yes, another thing that Barbie and Ken had a conflict about, I almost forgot to mention. Will we have a kitten or a puppy? So that's Barbie and Ken. Any quick questions before I move on to courtship models? David and Bathsheba? Did I miss anything? I'm going to ask the Barbie experts if I missed anything.
I do remember Barbie being a stewardess in the 70s.
Okay.
At one point.
Okay, sounds good, sounds good. That was the ultimate job back then.
He was Pan Am.
Oh, very cool. Okay, well, we'll move on to David and Bathsheba then. Now, I have what I call here in my notes, I call them the bad courtship model, but I realize there are going to be positive and negative things in any courtship. But I just basically took the ones that I thought were best exemplified, things we might want to emulate or avoid. So, in the case of David and Bathsheba, well, David, his name says a lot about him. The name Dov in Hebrew actually means bear. And my oldest son is named David, and my wife was really mad at me when it turned out he was the screamiest child anyone ever did see. My mother-in-law was afraid to watch him after having 11 grandchildren. He scared her. So I wanted to name our daughter Ariel, but when my wife looked it up and saw it meant Lioness of God. No, not going to happen. Not after the bear. But David, David, means beloved. And Bathsheba, her name means mother of the promise. So we can see, obviously, how these names prefigure Christ and Mary. But their lives are not as idealistic as I think we'd like to believe. First off, David, in the language that my middle school students like to use, David is what they call a playa. He's very popular, and by age 12, he kills Goliath, and Saul is riding with him in his chariot. He's riding right next to the king, and all the people are shouting, Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000. So right at age 12, he knows what it's like to be the big bug on the wall, as one of my students said today. I really like that one. It's almost easy to understand Saul's paranoia because the people, the army, by the time David is about 18 years old, the people, the whole army, Saul's son, who's in line to inherit the throne, and Saul's daughter, they all love David. So he starts throwing spears at him. Sometimes popularity can make you feel too special, like the rules don't apply to you. And I think that happens here with David at one point. David gets married. And does anyone know who he marries offhand, his first wife?
Saul's daughter.
Saul's daughter, McNichol. Saul figures he'll send David on a suicide mission. Kill me 200 Philistines. And since this is the young adult group, I can mention, he has to basically cut off 200 Philistine foreskins to show that he actually has done the deed. Actually, no, he's told to kill 100. He kills 200. Yeah, exactly. So David does that. He's again he's the army's hero. He kills 200 Philistines and gives that as a wedding present to his new father-in-law. Hooray! But When Saul starts seeking his life, David runs into the wilderness. He spends 10 years being a kind of a Robin Hood figure, but he takes 3 other wives while he's in the wilderness. This is after McNichol helps him escape her father's wrath at one point by putting a dummy in his bed. As if that wasn't enough, eventually McNichol is forced to marry another man. Saul wants to name someone else his heir, not David. So David ends up marrying a 4th wife. Her name is Abigail, which we joke about because that's the name of my son's girlfriend, and his name is David, and her name's Abigail. So she saves, she is married at the time, but she saves David's men from hunger. Her husband dies of a heart attack because he hates David. David marries Abigail. Now, here's the problem. When you go outside the one man and one woman framework set up by God with Adam and Eve, you have problems. So, and you see this as early as Abraham when he takes, a couple of extra wives just to try and help God along with kids. Well, now you end up having Ishmael, the father of the Arabs, and Isaac, the father of the Israelites, the longest running case of sibling rivalry in history, is what my old teacher Scott Hahn calls it. But, so when you move out of that framework, that's when you have trouble. So David finally becomes king. He's on the roof one day and he sees Bathsheba. She becomes a kind of a femme fatale. David already has many wives and many concubines. One of the simple way to put it, when you're king and you're successful, a lot of other kings want to do business with you. Nowadays we'd sign treaties. Back then you married one of their daughters. So he's got a lot of these types of daughters. He's got a lot of concubines. He sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop. He sees her and he must have her. Well, David is often given, painted as the bad guy in this kind of a situation. But it's also worth noting that David and Bathsheba, he sends for her. She comes immediately, doesn't put up a fight. They engage in sexual intercourse, and she conceives of a child. Again, some scholars have noted that according to Jewish purity laws, a woman has to wait 7 days after her menses end before purifying herself ritually in a mikvah. It's a special kind of immersion pool, so that she and her husband may resume relations. Well, the biblical text here, when they're describing Bathsheba's bath, it implies that she is engaging in this ritual purification that David sees her taking. Now, depending on the length of a woman's period, this 7-day injunction before purification, it virtually guarantees that after this period is done, she's either ovulating or close to ovulating once her and her husband resume relations. And so Bathsheba, by taking her bath on the roof, not only, if she is consciously trying to tempt David, she's letting him know that she is not only available, her husband is off fighting David's wars. Okay? She's not only available, but she's available and she's ready to conceive a child. Well, they do have relations at one of the best possible moments for her to conceive, and she does, with tragic results. David tries to cover up his sin. Okay? So this is their courtship. They start by him seeing her, a married woman, taking a bath. They end up engaging in adultery, and his idea of covering it up, he calls Uriah back, has a big party. Okay, go on home to your wife. Uriah says, no, I can't do that. My soldiers aren't allowed to go home for a conjugal visit. I can't either, in conscience. So this guy is incredibly moral, and David can't just order him killed, or can he? Those of you who know the end of the story, he ends up being put in the thick of battle on David's orders, so he gets killed. Finally, David marries Bathsheba. Anybody know what happens next?
The child dies.
Well, so what happens next is the prophet gets a sign from God that David's done something that's just deplorable in God's eyes. And so he goes and he calls David on the carpet, and there's a kind of, he says like kind of a parable kind of thing about, isn't it a shepherd and sheep?
Kind of, yeah. A poor man.
A poor man, oh that's right, a poor man and a rich man.
Yep.
The poor man has his sheep taken away from him, and the rich man has a sheep taken away from him, or something like that. And and David says how worse off But the poor man had his one sheep taken from him,
Mhm.
then the rich man who had a sheep taken from him. And that, or the rich man took the sheep, I don't remember. But-
Rich man takes the poor man's
poor
lamb.
man's sheep,
It's a lamb
yeah,
and kills it.
And kills it. And David said that he would kill that rich man for taking that, or something,
Yeah.
you know, or lock him up or something like that for the
Mhm.
for this crime of killing this poor man's only lamb. And so the prophet says, well, that's you. You're the rich man. And David like realizes, it just all comes to a head, and he realizes what he's done. And then that's just like this, I mean, he just begs God for mercy, and he turns everything back around and like makes it all honest. But that's where we get some of the most beautiful Psalms from,
Yes.
this period when David's in absolute shame for what he's done.
Right, and David makes a public confession to his entire kingdom. I did this. And yeah, that's a huge moment when Nathan points to him and says, you're the guy, thou art the man. And that's part of the reason why the early Christian community, when we would do confession, we would not do it just one-on-one with the priest. The priest would be present, but you would confess to the entire congregation at once with the priest there. And that's what your penance could be. The congregation might shun you as well. That's mentioned in the book of Acts. Well, David does confess his sin. He does try to make good, but the problem is damage is done. This courtship was started. Fruit of the poison tree is one legal term, I think. Zachary might remember that one.
Yeah.
But
Sixth Amendment, yeah.
there you go. But his courtship starts off in a bad way. So as a result, his first child dies that he conceived with Bathsheba. Okay. They have tons of civil war. Another wife. Absalom's mad because the son of another wife attacked Absalom's sister by another one of David's wives. Okay, it's really complicated. You think your family has problems. There's intersibling rivalry and murder. Absalom kills Amnon, and there's a whole massive deal. There's attacks from external enemies. A plague sweeps through David's kingdom when he takes a census. There's a huge amount of sadness. And what's interesting is Bathsheba, when David is at his older, he rules the kingdom for another 25 years after he and Bathsheba are married, at least. He rules Israel for a total of 40 years. When he's dying, okay, they bring a young girl. They make a point of saying he did not have relations with her, but they bring a young girl in to keep him warm in his bed at night. Okay? Where's Bathsheba? Where's his wife at? Well, Bathsheba, she comes in. The next time we see her, next to last time we see her, she comes in and tells David, there's a problem. Another one of your sons wants to take the throne away from my son, Solomon. So, okay, what do you think's happening here, Caitlin?
More rivalry.
More rivalry, right. But Bathsheba's whole thing is keeping her son on the throne. And then later on, after David's dead, it's Bathsheba who goes up to Solomon and says, you know what, that brother who tried to take your throne, he wants to marry this girl over here. Could you do that for him? Solomon bows to his mom, puts a throne at his right hand, and says, I'll never refuse you anything. But when she says this guy wants to marry this girl, Solomon just barks back at her. What? Why don't you? Because if he marries this girl, if an unfortunate accident happens to Solomon, his brother gets the throne. Solomon flies into a rage, kills his half-brother. Okay. So what happens is, yes, David makes good with God, but his whole marriage to Bathsheba is filled with trouble. She is all about getting her son on the throne, and then he makes her his advisor, and she's all about keeping him on the throne. She is all about her son more than David, it would appear, by the end of the whole fracas. So their marriage is marred because it starts bad. Compare that to, instead, Ruth and Boaz, because I'm starting to go on just a little bit too long, but that's okay, I guess. Compared to, say, Ruth and Boaz. Ruth, if you know that story, Ruth is not an Israelite. Okay? Ruth is actually a Moabite. They are descended from Abraham's nephew, Lot. Okay? They are not, they are basically sworn enemies at one point. They are sworn enemies of the Israelites. And Ruth ends up being in a kind of a situation where her Israelite husband dies, but she becomes really good friends and stays with her mother-in-law, Naomi. So, she stays with Naomi when her mother dies. As a widow, she is incredibly vulnerable. Okay? Basically, women back then were protected by men the whole way through. You're in your father's house until you're about 14, and then you get married off to your husband. And once your husband dies, you're taking care of one of your sons, by one of your sons. Ruth and Naomi, they are two widows. They don't have any options like that. They're powerless. You only have two options, really, at this point in time. Prostitution, which you're not supposed to do, obviously, or you can pick up loose grain dropped by the harvesters at harvest time and eat from that. Boaz is a nice guy. He notices her. Okay? She's pretty. He ends up asking, who is she? Well, she takes care of her widowed mother. Wow, that makes an impression on Boaz. And he not only has her eat with him and his workers, he tells her, you stay in my field. I've told all my men not to bother you. And then he takes his men aside and says, jump for some extra grains and some corn husks and a bunch of other stuff for her while she's doing this. Well, Ruth, actually the name means friendship. Okay? In Hebrew, the word is rivet. And they find out that Boaz is not only a blood relative, he is close enough they could marry. He could marry her, not close enough he can't marry her. And he is willing to be what is called a goel, a kinsman redeemer. Okay? He can actually buy back or redeem Ruth from her state of widowhood, and she will get the land that her husband essentially was supposed to get through him. It's a prescribing of Jewish law. Well, this is a courtship which is moral and chaste and based more upon love than lust and anything else like that. And this makes Boaz a type of Christ. He's our Redeemer and our kinsman, one family through Adam. Ruth you could see as a type of Mary. She's a co-redeemer. She takes the harder, virtuous route and even follows foreign customs at one point. For her, it's a foreign custom. The way that you actually let a man know that you wanted to marry him back then, if you found out where he was sleeping, you basically uncovered his feet, laid down beside him, and then covered yourself up with his blanket. Or sometimes they use the word robe or skirt or something like that. But whatever it is, Boaz is kind of surprised. What are you doing? Well, I am your kinsman. I'm your kinswoman. In essence, Ruth does become King David's ancestor. Her son, Obed, becomes King David's grandfather. And she, although she is a foreigner, it shows that, and ultimately she's Christ's ancestor too because of this. Well, the message we get from Ruth and Boaz, the harder, virtuous road pays off. Despite personal tragedies, it's like a dead husband, God can always write a happier ending. The best spouses are impressed by virtue. One of the few pieces of advice with girls that my dad gave me, but the ones he did give me were really good. But first one he gave was, beauty attracts you, it's not what keeps you. Beauty attracts Boaz to Ruth, but what keeps him interested in her is her virtue. Okay? And likely, you end up, even though there were more eligible women in town, Boaz ends up paying the price to get her, a foreigner and a widow. Okay? So, moving right along from that. Any questions? Courtship-wise? Okay. Moving right along, I'm going to remove this. And I'm going to check and see what time we're at. And I'm doing okay. So, next one I wanted to look at quick was Adam and Eve. So, we all know the story. Okay? We all know sixth day, God makes man, all that. Has anybody, well, Adam and Eve's courtship begins on the fifth day when Adam starts naming the animals. This shows two things. Number one, he's got dominion over them, but number two, he's different from them. He names them. They don't name each other. So when it's only God that changes anybody's name in the Bible. And so when Adam names them, it shows that he has the dominance over them that God has over us. Well, Adam's got a fairly good job. Till the garden and keep it, which means guard it. When he realizes that he doesn't have a partner, God makes Adam fall asleep. Adam's rib is taken. Now, rib is an Arab cognate. It's a word that means your best buddy, your best friend, your closest ally. So today we might call somebody who's a really good worker my right arm. Back then, the Arab would call somebody like that my rib. Man and woman are made for each other. They are not incomplete. They are complete as a communion of persons. Okay? They are equal persons. Okay? They are of equal value, although they are different. C.S. Lewis likens man and woman to a bow and a fiddle. You could argue that the fiddle or the violin gets a lot more attention, but the violin can't do its job without the bow. And here's the neat thing, they are told, be fruitful and multiply. We get to cooperate in the Creator's work. Sounds great. We're in trouble when we go out of that framework of one man and one woman. So we saw what happened with David and Bathsheba and Absalom, other places too. So why do we have the fall? Well, the serpent, and the name is Nahash for serpent in Hebrew. It's used, the mythical dragon in Isaiah. They're used to describe the fiery serpents in the desert that bite the Israelites and almost wipe them out. And the great sea monsters in Job that God puts a fish hook in. Okay. So it's something venomous that bites. Well, the serpent, the Nahash, ends up, it's not just this little tiny garter snake that they usually show in the movies or the old movies like the Bible, where Adam and Eve have those strategic leaves and branches and long hair and things like that just manage to protect the purity of any children watching, and this snake slowly twines around. No, this thing is really ugly and evil. Well, the serpent, here's what's interesting. The serpent, when he's talking to Eve, he uses the plural when he's talking to Eve. Did God really tell you guys that you're going to die if you eat this fruit? So the point is that when Eve is looking at this serpent, Adam is standing right beside her. His job is to guard the garden. When she takes the fruit and bites it, he's watching her do it. Okay? He's not doing his job, is the problem. He's not guarding Eve at the garden. He watches while she eats it, and then, what happens?
He eats it.
Well, he eats it after what?
After
she eats it. Well, yeah. She says, look, it didn't bother me. It didn't hurt me. You have some. Okay. And as Bill Cosby puts it, God shows up, everybody out of the pool. But first, before that, he does it too. But a lot of the stuff that didn't make sense to me in the Old Testament makes so much sense now that I'm a dad. Because I always wondered when I was a little kid, why does God, number one, why is he walking through the garden when he could be wherever he darn well pleases? Number two, why does he say, Adam, where are you? Well, he's God. He knows darn well where Adam is. Okay? Did you do what I told you not to do? Good. God's giving them every chance to repent. Question?
No, I was just going to say the Adam and Eve stuff sort of seems boring and tame compared to starting out with David. It's like once you start with the David stuff and everything, what's going to surprise you?
No, maybe so. But I want to start out with the courtship and then the marriage. But yeah, well, the marriage sometimes can seem tamer than the courtship. But actually, as anybody who's been married for any length of time can tell you, it's got its ups and downs too. But yeah, God gives them every chance to confess their sins. Instead, what do? Well, have you ever, those of you who have had siblings, again, I grew up as an only child. I didn't really have the opportunity of blaming my siblings for anything. If anything went wrong, I'm busted. I can't blame the dog. But how many people tried to put something on their siblings that they did when they were growing up? Okay, only one person. Wow. Okay. Oh, 2 people. Okay, great. Okay, well, only 2 people. Okay, three. Okay, not too bad. Got 3 honest people here. So what happens? Well, Adam, first thing he does is he points it back at God. The woman you gave me. The woman you gave me did this to me. She gave me this stuff, and I ate it. So he's avoiding responsibility. Eve, well, the serpent did this to me. The serpent gave it to me. Again, you did it. You put the serpent here. So what do we have? We got the first marital argument. They're so busy trying to avoid blame, they don't see what they've done to each other spiritually. They don't see what they've done to themselves. Okay. And again, early on, the first year of marriage, they say you've got you have the biggest fights usually in the first year of marriage. You have the highest highs and the lowest lows. And more than once, I know when I would be driving with my wife, she might say, I would realize I goofed up, but the first thing in your mind is, I don't want to get in trouble. So you find a way to either turn it back on them or say it wasn't my fault. Yeah. And eventually you get to a point, at least I did, somehow I got there before my wife justifiably killed me, but I eventually have gotten to a point where for most of the time, when I'm wrong, I can admit it, and we just move forward and figure out how to fix things up. But these guys are so messed up, they do not see how far they've fallen. And and they don't see what they've become compared to their former selves. Now, the last words we hear from Eve, she says, God has granted me another offspring in place of Abel, since Cain has killed him. She names the child Seth. He has granted. The last thing, at least, we hear Eve say is that what God has given me is good. So she's happy for that. Seth's people, they end up following God, whereas Cain's end up building cities and making a name for themselves. Well, Adam and Eve, again, at least Eve is smartened up, and hopefully Adam has by the end. But what has happened to our relationships now since the curse? Well, when we're fruitful, when we do what God tells us to do, that wonderful gift, childbirth will be painful. Okay? Family life, it's going to be an image of God's love, but it's going to be marred by sin. Sibling rivalry. Okay? Teen rebellion against parents. Oh yeah. I was just telling Caitlin how, my parents are, God love them, they don't do this too often. When I say, oh, my teenage son and my teenage daughter's driving me nuts. Oh, really? Tell us all about it, John. Tell us. Yes. And, of course, marital conflict. Work. Well, work was supposed to be a joyful thing. Instead, it's toil. I forget who it is, the bald guy with the goatee. His book is called, It's Called Work for a Reason. Well, work didn't used to be toil. Nature is no longer our friend. Nature does not want to make us feel good with an Enya music in the background. Nature wants to decompose us. Life is going to end in suffering because death is inevitable. So, bad marriage in that sense. Compare that to Mary and Joseph. Well, what's interesting is you end up with, let's take a look at Mary first. She goes with God's will, even when she's confused and doesn't understand. Let it be done to me. Okay. A lot of us don't want to move forward unless something makes sense. A lot of us may disagree with the church if something doesn't make sense to us at the time. Okay? But it's not our job necessarily to make the church justify it and make sense to us. It's our job to obey the dictates of the church that Christ put in our place. Like Mary does when the angel arrives and explains to her what she has the opportunity to participate in. Her words, let it be done unto me according to your word. Her soul, as a result, magnifies God. All generations will call me blessed. Mary prophesies when she agrees to be part of God's plan. Okay? When in need, she goes not to one of her peers, the way most teenagers would. Mary traditionally is seen as about being 14 years old. Okay? She has not had a bat mitzvah yet or any of the other rituals. She's engaged to Joseph. It has the power of a marriage in our modern understanding. But when she has difficulty, she doesn't go to her peers. She goes to a more aged family member named Elizabeth, who's been pregnant with John the Baptist for 6 months. Her yes is a contrast to Israel's disobedience throughout history. Okay? Mary, his mother, later on when Jesus is 12 years old, and Mary is all of about 24, Mary keeps all these things in her heart when she finds him after being lost for 3 days, when she finds him in the temple. She is the keeper. Now, Mary and Joseph don't understand, just as Mary did not fully understand before, but they keep everything in faith. Also a counter to Adam and Eve. They sin when they don't get it. Makes sense to me. The serpent doesn't necessarily done anything to me, and he's kind of scary besides. God I don't see right now. Doing what makes sense to us, and only what makes sense to us, sets us up for failure. And again, I liken it to when, say, my 6-year-old, it makes sense to him that he should be able to play with his Legos when he's in his 30s and 40s, like Dad is. Dad, why don't you play with Legos anymore? What's wrong with you? Well, I could, but hopefully, by the time you're 30 or 40 years old, you've got other things in mind. Okay? So my 6-year-old, much as I love him and as much as he loves me, he can't understand me. He can't understand my motivations. If I can't play catch with him because I'm on a deadline for something, I can't really explain the roof over your head depends on me completing this on time without possibly traumatizing him. Just know, later on, trust me on this, you can't handle it, you're not cleared for this one, pick your metaphor. So, in the case of Joseph, though, Joseph, again, we had a speaker a while ago at the Theology on Tap who was of the opinion that Joseph was 18 years old and that he and Mary were deeply in love. And there's A little bit of evidence for that, mainly through pictures that were discovered early on in Christian history, where Joseph is portrayed as a young man. That's about it, though. Tradition has said that Joseph was significantly older than Mary. He was an established carpenter, able to provide for her. And Joseph is interesting in that, like another Joseph, God speaks to him primarily in dreams. Okay? The first thing that is often told to Joseph in a dream, don't be afraid, to Mary, just as Mary was told. The first thing an angel usually has to say is, don't be afraid. The second thing is usually get up off the floor. But in neither case here is that the case. Maybe that's why it appears to Joseph in a dream. But the next thing he's told to do is run to Egypt. Now, the last speaker I mentioned at the Theology on Tap, he did mention one thing that was worth noting. We never hear Joseph speak in any of the Gospels. What we do see him do is act. So, where Mary says yes to God and yes to God's plan, Joseph, when he hears God's plan, he acts on it. So I think it's worth noting that men are frequently known for not talking as much as women. And I think my wife wishes I was more like that sometimes, but that's me. But Joseph, he doesn't really speak throughout any of the Gospels, but he does act. As soon as he is given a directive by God, he acts on it, and he brings his family with him. Even though Mary is undoubtedly holier than he is, and his son is undoubtedly holier than he is, he acts on God's will, and his wife and child follow. Mary speaks for them on a number of occasions, but she recognizes in their marriage that she and Joseph are one. When they find Jesus at the temple, she doesn't say the thing, well, okay, I know I wouldn't have done if I had disappeared for 3 days. But in any case, the first thing she says is, son, why have you done this to us? She unites her and Joseph. Even though she's Queen of all saints and Joseph is often pushed to the side, she speaks with them. She speaks of them as a united unit. Okay. Well, what happens as a result of their... Oh yeah, and let's also take a look at, for me, the only time we really see Mary and Joseph interacting in the Gospels, doesn't mean they didn't interact much, but the only time we see them interacting is when they have to find Jesus when he's gone for 3 days. My cousin, when he was 6 years old, turned up lost at the Toronto Planetarium. And immediately, I love my aunt and uncle, but immediately they begin blaming each other. Why weren't you watching him? I was watching him. Why weren't you here? And they are just at each other. Meanwhile, the entire planetarium is going on lockdown. The security guards are patrolling the parking lots and every possible exit, entrance, and bathroom stall in the entire place. And they find my cousin, 6 years old, sitting in the family car. And his first words, Mommy, where were you? I've been waiting for you here for 2 hours now, or whatever it was. Okay. When my aunt and uncle lost my cousin, again, God love them, they're great parents, he's doing great for himself, he's a great father, and all that. But the instinctive thing that many parents want to do is get out of trouble, and they do that by blaming each other. So, Mary and Joseph, we see that here. They go, they look for him for 3 days. We don't get any sense that there's conflict. They are a team, and their job is to get something done. And if there's a mistake, well, you don't yell at them for it. You move forward and see how you can fix the situation because you're a team. What happens because of their obedience? Well, we do still have kids in pain. But we can remove the defect of sin through baptism, which Jesus institutes and raises to a sacrament. Our relationships are still marred by sin, but we can remove that sin through confession to God through a priest. Work is still toil, but even the most suffering, awful job can be a form of prayer and redemption. Okay? Because all work, all moral work, was blessed by Christ who worked. And physical death is still going to come, but we can look forward to eternal life in heaven and a glorified body like Christ's at the end of that time. All because of the obedience of Mary and Joseph. Well, for conclusion, our courtships ought to be focused towards marriage. We've tried to push this and make sure our children understand that. Only go out with a date who could make a good mate. Our marriages ought to match the passionate intimacy of Christ and the church, his bride. I've got some supplementary materials there from both from the Catechism of the Catholic Church and a really good article by a gentleman named Dr. Gregory Popchak, who's also a Steubenville graduate. Yeah, be true to your school, but we can live as joyful lovers serving each other. A lot of married couples who seek counseling, apparently they live more as roommates. Their social and other needs are met, but they don't have an actual level of emotional intimacy that both are satisfied with. And that is what we're called to have as Catholics in marriage. That is the Catholic standard. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. It's easy to think of yourself taking a bullet for your wife, but doing the dishes, or when you don't want to, or taking out the garbage, or driving the kids to soccer practice, that takes a lot more work. First priority in marriage, raising each other to sainthood. Second priority, raising the kids to sainthood. So, if you see each other as a team, as Mary and Joseph did in finding Jesus, not as adversaries trying to escape blame, as Adam and Eve did, okay, you're definitely moving forward. It is okay to be attracted by beauty, as with Ruth and Boaz, but rather be known for your virtue and character. Choose a mate based upon this, rather than Barbie characteristics. My dad actually sat me down once and just chatted with me about, well, why do you like that girl? Oh, she's a good dancer, and she's pretty, and, you know, she's got this. Have you ever done the dishes together? Oh, 16 years old, never thought about that. Have you ever done wallpaper together? No. Duh. Wallpaper? What do I want wallpaper room for? Okay. Okay. But ultimately, we're all called through our courtships to eventually have marriage and mirror the love that Christ has for his bride, the church. Thank you. And I can move this aside and I can sit down. So, any questions?
I have a comment.
Okay.
I dated a guy for 3 years.
Okay.
And one of the last things we did together was make cupcakes.
Oh.
And there's a reason why it was one of the last times we ever did anything together, because we had a gigantic fight about the cupcakes. And it was just like the wallpaper thing.
Right.
Really similar. Have you ever done the dishes together? Have you ever done wallpaper or something like that? We tried to make cupcakes and we couldn't make cupcakes because he thought the frosting was supposed to go on before the cupcakes had cooled, and I said no, it's supposed to be after. Anyway, or else it's just going to turn into a poem. So yeah, definitely.
You were right.
I mean, like, I know, I'm right. I know. It was
Yeah,
right.
but I saw
I know.
it doesn't work.
So we're still arguing who's right and wrong here.
And then
Okay.
when I was like, fine, you frost your half of the cupcakes before they cooled, and I'll frost afterwards. And it turned into a puddle, and he said, well, I think it's just fine. I'm like, no, it's a mess. And then he realized he was wrong, but then he kept like putting, the blame away. And that's at that point, I'm like, we are never gonna make this relationship work. So,
Because you can't frost.
because we can't even frost cupcakes. I mean, we can't even agree about that. But then I turn around and my parents, we always call them the parental unit because they were always one on everything. And even when they have their minor disagreements, they kind of look at each other and then they look at us and they're like, we're going to talk and then we'll decide. So my parents are always one unit. When you ask one, you're asking the other something. And they are still.
Or when one tells you no, you dare not go ask the other one.
It's always big trouble if you did that.
You don't divide and conquer.
You do not divide the parents. You never sit between them. Great. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go too. It's nice to hear you speak. I enjoyed
Thank
your
you
talk.
so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
I
it.
would stay longer, but I have to.
Good one.
Thank you.
Don't forget to take your supplementary. There we go.
Yeah, no, I
There'll
got
be a
it.
quiz. There'll be a quiz afterwards.
All right.
See ya.
Good luck with everything.
Thanks.
But I think I told you guys this story before, but I love when you're talking about how when they lost Mary and Joseph, or when they lost Jesus in the temple. Char Vance is a Catholic comedian, and she always sheds light on those stories. And she's like, "Okay, you are a unit. Mary and Joseph, they lose Jesus at the temple, and they're going home. Mary thought Joseph had him. Joseph thought Mary had him, and then she's like, when they realized that neither one had him, they're like, oh, let's just go back and find him. And she's like, ladies, men, have you ever lost your checkbook? Ladies, have you ever lost your makeup bag? Mary and Joseph lost Jesus. And the whole
You
place
lost God's kid and they didn't fight. So yeah, think about that. Oops.
Well, even now, like when I I can remember, like, my dad would hold his keys like this, and he would not let go until we said, "We will give them back to you." We would do this with his keys until those words came out of our mouth.
No, that's true. And I remember, this is one story I like to relate, and it may not sound big at first, but my father, he passed, my biological father and my mother split when I was 7, and I did not see him again. And when he died when I was 28, I really wanted to get to know him as best I could. I found he had gone to an anger management group at one point in his life. So I found one here in the Portland area and just sat in on a few sessions. And one of the things that really surprised me and helped me to really appreciate my own marriage and how good my wife is was the fellow leading the group said, well, sometimes if I'm driving with my wife, she'll say, oh, you should have gone left. And I just say, okay. And there was this hush as all these guys were like, what? Really? You can do that? You can't, you don't start a fight when, you know, you're told you're going the wrong way? There was just this bizarre notion that you wouldn't fight over something like that. It could be the cupcakes, it could be something else. Mm-hmm. But you're right, as a unit, you know, you can just say, oh, okay, yeah, you're right, I should have gone this way. Let's try seeing what we can find to do and get back on track. So, but yeah.
We're constantly working together.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that my parents are amazing. They run a business together. They spend almost every waking moment of their lives together, and they hardly ever fight. I'm like, how do you guys do that? Because they work together in the same office, like back to back.
Alcohol, though.
No, not really. Well, yeah, but no. But you know, they're photographers, and he writes a wine article, but you know, it's not like that. But still, like, they just enjoy the time they spend together, and that's just like been this amazing model for me. And you know, it's so in this world where so many relationships aren't good. They're Barbie and Ken relationships, mm-hmm. and my parents have a Mary and Joseph kind of relationship. I mean, this is huge standard mm-hmm. that I've been so blessed to have as a kid, and especially now as a young adult, where I'm in this whole dating world.
I like your face.
I'm trying to arrange a date right now. So,
oh, is that what? Okay. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. So, you know, it's taking me to happy hour. So, anyway, no, I'm like legit, seriously. Anyway, so that's just like been this whole thing. It's just amazing. I want to have that for my kids.
And if I could just jump in. I'm going to make sure I hit the pause so that, because it's nothing that my wife